Welcome to Untold Physio Stories podcast, your perfect commute resource with physio failures, successes, interesting cases, and more from the physio and rehab world, with your hosts, Drs. Andrew Rothschild and Erson Religioso.
Try these in your practice. Email my exclusive promo code MMT2 to helix at helix4pain.com to receive samples of these new professional pain relief creams and find a medical supply distributor near you. You'll get a starter kit with several samples, patient information brochures, and it's a great way to help patients and grow your practice.
Welcome back to Untold Physio Stories podcast. I'm your host, Dr. E, with Modern Manual Therapy, Modern Rehab Mastery, and live Modern Manual Therapy courses and more are back this year. So if you want to host a course and learn and earn, because we do have a profit sharing model, just make sure to reach out to me on social media or email me through the links in my podcast or in any of my sites. And my co-host is
Dr. Andrew Rothschild with Modern Patient Education.
All right. Andrew's just been a little under the weather for the past couple of weeks. So if you hear him sniffling or a little bit of cough, he's trying to mute it, but I know he has to talk eventually because he's on the podcast. So just give him a little break. It was like me about a month ago or so when I was a little under the weather.
Yeah, thankfully, the only things that make me cough are talking and laughing. So we don't do any of that here.
No, we are totally serious, and we don't even talk in this podcast. So I had a small update on the ipsilateral lateral shift. There was an MDT PT who commented on it, and after listening to the podcast, and just FYI, if any of you guys are struggling with an ipsilateral lateral shift or you happen to see one in the future, what he said is that one of the Mackenzie faculty had started experimenting with just thoracic rotation instead of trying to load the lumbar spine. So he didn't really get into specifics of whether it was the seated, I don't think it was thoracic whips, but it might have just been seated thoracic rotation with overpressure to try to correct the shift. And he said he's been having some good success with that. So if
Doing
you follow
it
up
towards the involved side or away from?
I can only imagine that it would probably be away because they're shifted, plus they're somewhat rotated. You know, it's not like a shift is purely in a side bending plane, right? So I did, and that reminded me too. I saw someone, and I don't know if I podcasted about him, but I definitely made some social media videos, and he was on my Instagram and my YouTube. It was a former PT who I used to work for, and he came to see me after he developed some low back pain after a fusion failed. And his hardware is very similar to yours. When he showed me his X-ray, it was just like busted. You know, I think some of his hardware and screws had broken or maybe not fused. I don't know exactly what happened, but he was laterally shifted. And I think it was, I'm not sure if it's an ipsilateral shift or contralateral shift. I believe it was ipsilateral, but this wasn't discogenic or anything. It was literally that his hardware had collapsed on one side. And he shared me those x-rays. And I remember trying shifts and trying isometrics. And what actually made him better was actually just seated trunk rotation and then unilateral farmer's carries once he was straight. So there's definitely something to that trunk rotation based on my N of 1. And again, I also don't know how much that Mackenzie faculty member has seen too, because it's not like you see a lot of lateral shifts, much less ipsilateral lateral shifts. But if you happen to follow up now that you're back at work, you could even just try suggesting that to her. Just try seated trunk rotation, and it could be one way or the other, because it's always going to be. It's either going to make it better, make it worse, or not change.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to reach out to her and kind of find out what her status is and how she's been doing, and then maybe if it's worth depending on what's going on, maybe get her back in and see if it's not worth testing it out.
Mm-hmm. So now that we've just actually kind of talked through a couple of cases, I have an interesting story from my from my course that I taught, live course last weekend, and two of the questions got brought up by two separate PTs, and at the same time, one of the Modern Rehab Mastery mentees just happened to text me on our chat group the same question, and I'll ask this to you too. What about fusions and repeated end range loading? And we're talking like not acute fusions, but like, fusions a year or two after everything's been healed.
Yeah. I mean, I've done it for myself and not had any trouble with it. I've done it with patients, and yeah, I've done it with patients too. Um,
Yeah.
and like, again, especially sometimes people are a little more sensitive with it, or hesitant, I should say. And so I've definitely probably progressed it maybe a little bit more gradually than I would with patients who have not had fusions, but I haven't avoided it.
Yeah. And that was the whole point, and I say it all the time in my seminars as well, because for some reason people are somewhat hesitant to repeated end range loading of the spine. I think they are used to cranking on extremities, but there's something about the spine they feel like it's not as resilient or strong as other joints, And I always tell my patients, I'm like, hey, just because it has a spinal cord and lots of nerve roots, and many, many joints and a lot of ribs attached to it doesn't mean that you can't load it to end range just as much as you can, like crank on a hip or crank on a knee or crank on an ankle.
Right.
Like there's nothing special about it other than the fact that it's a spine and it has many, many joints as opposed to, one joint or two joints, depending on wherever you're looking on at in the extremities. That doesn't give you permission to be super aggressive, but I think people also they don't realize that it takes magnitudes of force to, really even to form fascia a minute amount. So I do say to them that, full repeated end range loading um, resets, they have the same indications and contraindications as mobilization and manipulation. And I took that because I heard that Dunning had once said of manipulation versus mobilization. People ask him in his courses, well, would you manipulate this or would you manipulate this? And he would always say, well, would you mobilize it? Because
Right.
mobilization has the same indications and contraindications as manipulation. So I just threw repeated end range loading on top of that. I'm like, they all have the same indications and contraindications. So if you would do a grade 3 or 4 to oscillation end range or thrust manip on it, would you repeat it in range load it? And
And
then for fusions, though, people are like, well, I wouldn't do it for a fusion. I'm like, you wouldn't do it to move the fusion, but you still
right.
might do you would do it for pain modulation potentially, and you would do it like the joints above and below. You just wouldn't expect the fusion. Like you're not going to break titanium. I always
Yeah.
tell them, right? You're not going to break screws. You're not going to break a titanium cage.
I mean, I
For this
did,
one,
but that's just me. I'm just,
oh right, yes, yes, Andrew. I'm not
but
even sure people know this. I mean, you could be the story for this particular episode. Do you
and it
want to
wasn't
tell
doing
people what
end
happened?
range. It wasn't doing end range movements. It just broke at some point.
Yes, but I mean, you don't even know. I mean, tell the
Right.
story.
Oh yeah, it's just within. So I had a fusion done in December of 2000 at L45, and at some point
Before he was a PT.
before I was a PT, so it got me interested in going to PT school. But I think it was within the first 2 years or 2 or 3 years, the fusion broke. Essentially, the one screw broke in half, and one on the other side detached from like the bracket, so to speak. Um, but the bony fusion was intact and solid, and so they just kind of left it. But it was one of those things where I'd been doing well for the first 7, 8 months after the surgery. Actually, no, I was doing well for about a year and a half after the surgery. And then I started going downhill, just a lot more localized back pain, achiness, and stuff. And that's why at some point within that first 2 years or 2.5 years, they had re-x-rayed it and saw that this had happened, but didn't know if it was related to the pain I was having. And it's been over 20 years now, and it's still in there, and it's hasn't been a problem.
Right. And Andrew does, he's a very active guy, does a ton of kettlebell work, um, lots of bending. lots of movement. Like he said, he's tried end range repeated loading on himself. And he actually has busted hardware inside him that they never removed. And he's also asymptomatic. That's great. It's good. In a way, you're very similar to the threatless TMJ case that I often talk about. Like if
Yeah.
you don't really even know the extent of it, like you don't know the extent of the trauma, is there even any perception of threat? Like
Right.
and luckily there was already no nocebo. It's not like you had worsening of pain once you found out that your hardware was broken.
Right. No, exactly
Yeah.
right. And I think I've seen different things too, like talking about this idea of that with nocebo, or even like with fear avoidance, that we can sometimes, as PTs, can contribute to that if we are hesitant about having patients move into certain directions, or with under certain loading parameters that will feed into those fears. So and that can be like, if we say, oh, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that, that can create a fear that wasn't already there, or add into a fear that a patient already has, when most of the time we should be trying to do the opposite of that.
For sure. And that was actually the case that I saw, the ipsilateral shift. I'm pretty sure it was ipsilateral now. He only had minor pain, and I think he was more worried that he was crooked. But before he came to see me, he kept on telling the surgeon, "I think something's wrong. I think something's wrong. Something happened to the fusion. Uh, and you need to do another scan." And the surgeon kept on saying, "Nothing's wrong. Nothing could possibly happen." The surgeon was like adamant that nothing was wrong, and then he finally, I don't know when, if the surgeon finally ordered a scan or if he went to a radiologist friend, but that's when he found out that all his hardware had pretty much collapsed and broke on one side.
Mm.
So the guy who asked me the question, back to the fusion question of the class, he actually had some previous history of neck pain. Um, he had some sort of, some sort of trauma. I believe it was swimming pool. I don't know if he dove in or something happened. Or I think he was in the pool. I think one of his kids like jumped on his neck, something like that. Then
Yeah.
he was hyperflexed, and he just could not. He couldn't extend at all, and the best he could get was neutral, no matter how hard he tried for months and months and months, maybe even a couple years. And he finally decided on a fusion, and based on fusions he had seen in the past, he asked the doctor, "Can you fuse me without any cages?" Because he didn't want to have trouble swallowing, because I guess he had seen several patients with trouble swallowing. And the doctor said, "Sure." So I'm not sure why, or why he had normal motion. But anyway, that resolved, and he had some just lingering set of radiculopathy and severe pain. He still had full range, surprisingly, in rotation and flexion, and just slight limitations in extension. He's mostly limited in retraction and side bending left. But throughout the course, that improved with all the resets and everything, and that completely resolved his pain. I was just more surprised that he had full motion from having 4 levels fused, as in like 4 segments, not 4 levels. Like
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
had C5 6, C6 7 fused, and I'm like, well, is that just because he only has screws in? Because he showed me a picture of his scan, and he had only 6 screws in each, between each of the two vertebral bodies, and no cages. But
Interesting.
it's still fused. I mean, I wouldn't expect him to have full motion. Like he had almost 90 degrees of rotation and full flexion and
Yeah.
pretty good extension. So I said, especially on you, what I normally say for repeated and range loading and fusions is that you're just not going to expect, like you might expect, a dramatic decrease in pain because you're still modulating pain and changing perception, which could change rapidly. But you're not going to expect, even if someone has limited range, you're just not going to expect whatever full range you would think they would have based on their age and morphology.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. It's always interesting. I've seen a few patients like that where they've had multi-level fuse, and their range of motion is still like almost too good. It's
yeah,
always,
it kind of
always
it
like,
kind of makes you
hmm.
worry in
Yeah.
some ways, right? Yeah, because we as PTs, if you guys are non-clinicians ever listening and thinking about a fusion, we always worry about, once you fuse something that's supposed to be moving, research shows, and that the discs above and below tend to herniate as well, just because they have excessive movement. And again, that was at least research that I looked at very early on in my career. I don't know if that's been repeated or if it even needs to be repeated. Have you ever heard of any updates on that?
No, I haven't heard any updates. I mean, it's one of those things that you just hear that's like a very normal thing, but it's hard to know. Is that something that's just been said for so long? It's become something that people say, or has it actually been studied effectively? And I haven't really seen anything new or updated on it.
Right, right. I mean, when people were even asking about fusions and disc replacements, I'm like, I even had looked into that population so long or that research. So if any of you guys actually treat this actively, or there's actual spinal surgery that is successful now,
Yeah.
you could reach out, because that's not something that I've ever looked into. It seems like no matter how much technology advances, there's never a good spinal surgery other than something minor like a microdiscectomy or minimally invasive spinal surgery where you don't fuse. It just seems like
Yeah.
anytime you remove things, you start to get laminectomies and fusions, or you start to replace discs with disc replacements. It seems like the outcomes are never as good as what is promised.
Yeah. I have seen though, because the disc replacements and like those are newer. Like I didn't have any of that, and that's been new that I've been seeing a lot more of over the last 5-7 years. They definitely seem more solid. I will say that.
In
Like,
the last 5 to 7 years.
yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Like when they add in like that disc piece along with when they do the fusion and they put sort of that
Hmm.
disc piece, that like wedge in there.
Hmm.
It definitely seemed like it's like, oh yeah, this thing is pretty solid in there.
Yeah. Well,
It's
my when I first started studying disc replacements, I know one of the theories as to why there were failures, or there's also a study I read where it was like a high percentage, somewhere between 50 and 75% of disc replacements end up with fusions, like a full-on cage fusion and a disc removal, um, somewhat later. Uh, they theorized it was because there's, I don't know how many body types. Let's just say there's an infinite amount of body types and body shapes, but there was only like four disc sizes for adults. You know what I mean? So it's not.
okay.
So chances are, it's they're just going to pick the one that fits, but it's not going to be like this puzzle piece perfect fit. So it's possible that maybe they have discs that shape better now. I don't know. Like I said, my ignorance is just because I haven't looked into it and I don't see the
Yeah.
population. But very early on, within the first like 3 to 4 years of disc replacements, I had looked at that research because I was seeing a higher population back then, and that was at least interesting from a theoretical standpoint, about no one, because no one ever thinks about that. It's not like they custom make these discs.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So where can people find you, Andrew?
People can find me mostly on Instagram at a Rothschild PT, and of course, Modern Patient Education and Modern Rehab Mastery.
All right. And I think you changed. Did you change your logo again?
No, this has been the same one now for a while.
Okay. Okay. I thought there was a kettlebell in there somewhere, or
There
like.
was there was but they changed it to this one like several months ago.
All right. I like it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Um. So yeah, if you guys have any similar stories, any funny stories, any huge physio fails, make sure to reach out to us. And you don't even have to guess. You can actually just write it out for us, and we can read it and talk about it and give you credit or make it anonymous. And we'd love to hear from you. So make sure to also rate us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts: Spotify, Stitcher, Google Google Podcast, or Apple Podcasts. You guys have a great day.
Untold Physio Stories is now sponsored by MyPT Insurance. Insurance just got easier. Through continued research, MyPT Insurance has crafted a policy that is economical and provides you with the peace of mind you need. Your extensive education, training, and experience as a PT allows you to assist clients in achieving their personal health goals. By practicing without individual professional liability insurance, you could be placing your career and future finances at risk. Whether you're a student, self-employed, or employed with a company, MyPT Insurance is here to provide affordable insurance coverage while protecting you and your patients. MyPT Insurance's plan also includes mobile coverage, which means it follows you wherever you work in the United States. Employed rates and self-employed rates are available. Visit myptinsurance.com/edge to sign up today.